Just a note before we start, this project has been generously funded by the Henry L. Hillman Foundation. We're going to get us started with just a few introductions. So to start, my name is Morgan Kasperowitz. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman with curly blonde hair. Today, I am wearing a green blazer and some gold jewelry, and I am sitting in my peachy pink office surrounded by a whole bunch of plants, and I am the manager of research and special projects for the Arts Council. I will pass to Natalie.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Happy Friday. My name is Natalie Larson. I'm a second-year Master of Arts Management student at Carnegie Mellon. And I'm also the former research intern for GPAC. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman with long brown hair. I'm wearing a black and gray sweater, and I'm sitting in my home office / bedroom with mint green walls.
Awesome. And today also we have some Arts Council staff with us. Allison Popesky, who is our Senior Manager of Programs, is here. She is helping us. She's waving. There she goes. She is going to be helping us with tech today. If you need any tech assistance or anything throughout, feel free to private chat her. She's also going to be dropping some things in the chat for you and monitoring that chat as well. And in addition, we have an ASL interpreter from the Sign Language Interpreter Professionals today. If you would like to pin our ASL interpreter, go to the top right of their Zoom box, and you can pin that to your screen so that you can see their box very easily. Anything else, Allison, tech-wise, before we get rolling?
No, we are good to go. Let's do this. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday, everyone. Great. So just to take the temperature of how we are entering this space today so that I can be, the best that I can be in terms of moving this conversation in the way that fits the folks that we have in the room, I'm going to ask you to type number 1, number 2, or number 3 into the chat based on how you're feeling. So I'm going to ask you which of these statements best represents how you're arriving at today's event. There is no right or wrong answer. 1, I've read the report, and I want to better understand or discuss what I've read. So if you are super interested specifically in talking more about what you have seen in the data in the report, number 1 is for you. Number 2, I have read the report and I have questions or ideas about how the data can be used. So if you have come into this really thinking about the next steps of what you've read in the report, number 2 is the number I'd like you to type. And then number 3, I haven't read the report. There was no requirement to do so. And I'm here to learn more about what's in it. So I'm going to ask Allison to let me know. I see a whole bunch of chats. What are you seeing in that chat, Allison? Okay.
Looks like a nice little mix of things. I see a lot of 3s.
I do see a lot of 3s as well.
Yes, I see a lot of 3s, some 2s. Oh, a couple 1 and 2s like that, little double.
Great. Okay, it's really helpful though for me to know, for example, that we have a lot of folks who haven't read the report yet. Again, there is absolutely no pressure to have done so. That just helps me know not to gloss over anything and make the assumption that you have already read it. So wonderful, yes. Wonderful. Yes, and I know some people may be occupying both spaces between 1 and 2, and that's great. Thank you for letting me know. Okay, so the goal and agenda of today is really to not just talk about what is in the report, so not just to talk about the what, but really to start this discussion with all of you about why this data matters and what comes next. Obviously, if you haven't read it before, you're seeing these things for the first time, you're processing them, understandable. But I know for me as a researcher on this project, I am actively thinking about, okay, what comes next? And while we have the space together today, I want to hear from you. So both myself and Natalie will share our perspectives, having looked at that data on why these findings matter and how we're thinking about applying them. But also I'm going to ask you throughout this webinar to bring your own reactions, to bring your perspectives and your questions. So we are going to start with just a tiny bit of background about this report in case this is the first time that you are interacting with a community survey project from the Arts Council. We'll go through the artist data and discussion. We'll talk about the organization data and discussion, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end if you have additional questions before we close. Great, so just a little bit of background on this project. So in preparation for this project, I went and looked back at the history of the community survey as part of the Arts Council. And I learned that the Arts Council has been doing a community survey in some form for over a decade, actually back to 2005. We've been doing this either annually or every other year. And it's always been focused on both artists and organizations, but over time, the purpose of this project, the content, the questions that we ask, and also how we report it have evolved quite a bit. So, a lot of times in the beginning, it was an opportunity for us to sort of take a pulse of our membership, take a pulse of the core of the community, and really think about what programs do we need to develop to address some of these things? And then as time has gone on, it's gotten a little bit more expansive in terms of what it covers. And then it's also been something that we have started reporting externally, or starting around 2016 was the first big one. So in 2016, we published a community survey report called Having Our Say. And then in 2018, the last one that we did, you can see that the last one was called Having Our Say Revisited, and that's the one you see on the screen. That was the last community survey that we did because of COVID until now. So in case you're curious about how we typically use this data, trends data, so data about quality of life for artists, financial trends, and other trends for organizations, those are things that we use directly in our advocacy work. Artists and organizations can also use this data to benchmark themselves against their regional peers and sort of see how they're stacking up to other folks in the field. And then this has also become justification for programs, not just for ourselves, but for other organizations. So one concrete example I can give you is in 2016, we found that artists were more often reporting that they earned income from teaching than from any other single source. So out of that was born our Teaching Artists Initiative. That statistic has since changed, but that was an example of a program that was developed based on data from this survey. Great, so we are going to go right into the artist data and discussion. I'm going to tell you in advance that we are only touching on a small part of what is in the report. There are lots more charts and lots more findings, especially lots more quotes in the report itself. But these are some of the key findings that we wanted to pull out, especially for that purpose of discussion, especially for that conversation around what comes next and what might we be missing in terms of the why behind some of these things that we're seeing. So the first section of findings in the report regarding artists has to do with COVID-19 impact. And Natalie really spearheaded the analysis of all of our artist survey data. So I'm going to pass it to her to talk more about what she saw in the qualitative data around COVID-19 impact for artists.
All right, so for this particular question, on the artist survey, we received about, I think it was 108 responses, and there were a lot of different kinds of stories. Artists experienced just a lot of different things as a result of the pandemic. So what we did here was we took out the kind of top 3 themes that we saw after going through every single story, and we did read every single story, and here the top 3 themes that we picked out. So the first one probably doesn't come as much of a surprise, but lost work, lost income, and lost artistic opportunities. And the second one, which was a little more of a positive one, was more time spent on art. So a lot of artists found themselves kind of exploring different mediums and just pushing their artistic practices to places where they may not have if it weren't for the pandemic. And the third theme was isolation. So we did read a lot of different stories of how this time impacted artists' mental health. And a lot of artists did report feeling kind of isolated from their peers and their community. And then along with that, we pulled 2 quotes that are representative of these themes. So I just want to pause here and allow you to read those. There are lots of others in the actual report that I also encourage you to read, just to get a sense of just the full impact that this had on the artistic community. So I'll just pause here for a moment. All right, so as I said, mental health was a big issue in these responses, but particularly for BIPOC artists, mental health was their top theme that we saw when we filtered out just based on BIPOC artists. They reported just being impacted a lot more negatively than others. So we pulled out some quotes, I believe, as well. So again, I want to just pause here and allow you to kind of read and reflect on these quotes.
Great. And as we kind of close out that section, I'll also say that I know that those are just a few we received, as Natalie mentioned. I think it was about 130. It was quite a few responses to that specific question. And there are more of those in the report. And just so you know, eventually down the road, we are also going to publish a technical report, which we often do, that will detail even more of those stories. So again, that's a very small portion. And I just want to note that there's a lot more to be shared in that space. So another major area of our findings were around artist quality of life. This was an important research question for us to sort of figure out, especially given the pandemic and what we assume is a fairly large impact on the lives of everyone, including artists. You know, what differences do we see between now and 2018 or between 2018 and now? And then in addition, you know, what are really, in terms of quality of life measures, what are the most pressing issues for our artists? So probably one of the most concerning to me was the large proportion of artists who reported making incomes of less than $10,000. And that is incomes not just from art. This is from all sources of income, including any, you know, part-time or full-time non-artistic work. In 2022, we saw 18.4% of artists report individual incomes at $10,000 or below, and about 4% of artists report household incomes of $10,000 and below. And what I want to pull out about this is the federal poverty line is actually higher than $10,000. The federal poverty line is about 13. It's a little over 13. And so when you're making an individual income, and that, by the way, is for a family of one. So if you're making an individual income of under $10,000, you're not just at the federal poverty line, you're pretty well below it. So especially with that rise between 2018 and now, that was a pretty concerning finding. And then here on the right, you see this sort of distribution of income for artists in 2022. And you'll notice, you know, that about 40% of our artists, or just around that, are making under $25,000. You know, we do have a good portion that are still making above that, but that's a fairly large portion of artists that are making income in those lowest two brackets. And then Natalie's going to share a little bit more about how this stacks up against the Allegheny County average as well.
Yeah, so when we compared these numbers to the Allegheny County poverty rate, you can see that's about 10.5%. The average artist percentage, artists who are making under $10,000 was 18%. So that's a difference of about 8 percentage points, which is pretty huge. we saw that this impacted emerging artists more significantly, and we are imperfectly, just want to note, defining emerging artists as artists who have been practicing their craft for about 5 years or less. We understand that's not a perfect definition, but that's just for the purposes of this research, how we interpreted it. And they are affected at about a rate of 26%, or rather about 26% reported individual incomes of under 10,000. So that's compared to the county rate is pretty huge.
Yeah, and if you feel comfortable in the chat, I'd love to know, does this surprise anyone? Does this feel, based on your experience in the arts community, does this feel like sort of expected data to you? Is this surprising to you? I think the proportion surprised me, I will say. I'm not surprised that people are making under $10,000 in our area, but I was surprised by the proportion. So if you're comfortable and you want to share what your initial reaction is, please do in the chat. Alrighty, so we are going to move to some social safety net data. So we do ask folks to report some of the social safety net programs that they do utilize. And an interesting thing that we found this year was for the past 3 surveys, we've seen a overall decreasing rate of usage of SNAP and Medicaid specifically. And those were the 2 most utilized programs across the board. Those are the 2 that are most often reported as being utilized by artists. And we've seen a decrease over time, despite the fact that we have seen those poverty level or below poverty level line incomes increasing. We've seen that rate increasing. And then this year, we looked at what the Pennsylvania average was for utilization of both these programs. And we found that, despite that, the poverty rates among our artists are above average in our community. Compared to the Pennsylvania average, they are utilizing these programs at a lower rate than that average. So that's what you see represented here. Oh, anything you want to add to that, Natalie? Sorry, I saw you unmute for a second.
No, sorry, that was an accident.
You're fine.
Morgan, I just wanted to point out real quick, I'm not sure if I want to hold off questions till the end, but there are a few in the chat. Do you want me to read them real quick, or do you just want to hold off on questions till the end?
Oh, no, let's while we're kind of on this section, let's do it.
Okay. So Tara asked, Tara said that she's not surprised. And did you find out that many were living on their own or with others?
Oh, that's a good question. We didn't collect data on whether or not people were living with roommates. We did see a rise in artists reporting living with family members. But that's not exactly the same thing. So that's a good question. I don't think we have full data on that.
Okay, and then Josie asks, that 10.5% is AC under FPL far exceeds 10K. Is that right?
Let me go back and see. You mean, can you read that one for me one more time?
Yes, and Josie, feel free to jump in if I'm
Yeah, Josie, is that Josie Innamorato?
Hey,
yes.
Morgan.
Hey.
I'm just curious, that 10.5% that was in the last bar graph.
Yes.
For Allegheny County.
Yes.
That's just under the federal poverty limit, which is some number like $33,000. So that 18.4% is artists under 10K, but that Allegheny County poverty rate is all people under 30 something. Is that right?
So yeah, I mean, given where we pulled the source from, I'd have to check that again. But you're right that it's however the census calculates that. So I would have to check that. That's a good question. It is, however, the census reports poverty level within the county.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No, thanks.
And that's good for questions on that section.
Okay, wonderful. Please do just type them into the chat. I'll try to address them, especially since some of it is very data specific. I'll try to address them as we go. Okay. Another piece of finding that was interesting for us, and I don't think we've ever looked at so closely before, was that we had a higher percentage of artists that reported being unbanked, which means you have no bank account, neither a checking nor savings account, or underbanked, which means you have one or the other, compared to the Pittsburgh average, because that's where we could find comparable data, was at the city level. We couldn't find it at the county level. And so that was definitely interesting. We also saw, I know, Natalie, you were going to touch on this too, we saw a decrease, generally speaking, in reports of having checking accounts. And there are some reasons for that we can imagine. Checking accounts require sometimes minimum balances or fees to maintain the accounts that become quite costly, especially if you are making some of those lowest incomes. But in general, our unbanked artist population from this group of respondents was 6.3%, and the Pittsburgh average was 3.4%. And what I will say about this is that there are actually some really great articles that have come out recently, and studies that have come out recently about why this matters. We didn't see really any we didn't see huge differences by race in our data, but nationally speaking, people of color are a lot more likely to experience being unbanked than the white population. And some of the difficulties, there are many. I'm not the expert on this. I can give you some more resources if you're interested, but some of the difficulties around being unbanked mean that it can be difficult to build your credit and build a credit score, and thus to access everything that comes along with having a good credit score. And then also because you don't have that institutional protection, you are more susceptible to theft and to fraud. If those are committed against you at an individual level, you don't have that institutional power to back you up in terms of restoring those funds. Anything you want to add in there, Natalie?
Yeah, I just have in my notes here that compared to 2018, the number of artists, Morgan, like you mentioned, without a checking account increased by about 17 percentage points, which is, again, pretty significant.
Awesome. Okay, so I guess with that, based on all that data, it's no surprise that our artists reported being slightly more challenged by taking care of their basic needs in 2022 over 2018, and this was especially true for BIPOC artists. All right, I'm gonna try to move this just a little faster because of time. Still, please put all those questions that if you have them in the chat, I may just address them at the end of this section. So one of the things that we have done consistently for a really long time is ask artists to rate challenges and barriers for their artistic career advancement. What you see on the screen here is the top 5 challenges and barriers based on how they were weighted in significance for all artists. So the left of the screen is all artists, and on the right, you see when that data is filtered specifically for BIPOC artists, you see those top 5 challenges and barriers for BIPOC artists. So what I will say about these top 5 barriers for all artists, those have been about the same since 2016. The one big difference, and sometimes they'll change positions a little, like number 2 might become number 3, but they've roughly been the same list of 5. The thing that's different this year is the lack of mentors and networks has not made it to the top 5 before. I wonder if that may have something to do with the isolation around the pandemic. That's an assumption, but just something that comes to mind for me looking at that data. And then the 2 things I want to pull out about our BIPOC artists is that many of the challenges are the same, but you can see that securing grants, fellowships, and donations was actually their top rated challenge, and that taking care of basic needs was in that top 5, whereas it was not for the average of all artists. Oh, Aaron, to answer your question, no, not necessarily. This is not all for artists who, it was not exclusive to artists who are receiving their main income from their practice. All right, and funding is also another place where we do ask a lot of questions and really want to pull out those answers because we know it matters a lot to our artists. So Natalie's going to talk about this, this graph right here and this interesting decline in the number of artists reporting that they received some funding from grants and residencies.
Yeah, so year after year, we've seen a decline in artists who receive funding from grants and residencies, and that could be due to a number of different reasons. Aside from COVID, we can make those assumptions, but we don't necessarily have the research or the data to back that up. And then there's another graph. So yeah, this past year, we found that about 80% rely on self-funding for artistic projects. So given the income difficulties that we saw previously, artists are struggling more and more to fund their artistic work, and are relying more on just trying to figure it out for themselves.
Yeah, and one other thing, well, two other things I'll add here. Natalie mentioned that we don't know exactly why we're seeing this decrease in grants and residencies. I was told when I presented this to our board, a lot of artist residencies shut down over COVID. That might be represented in that data. We might see that spike back up afterwards. The sample is slightly different. This is a continually more diverse sample every time we do this. So that may have the differences in people who answered may have some influence on that, but we thought it was important to note. And then Allison, this is where I might have you drop this in the chat. Another thing that would be helpful, I think I would love for you guys to explore after this, is Thomas Agnew of Boom Concepts recently released a Medium article that talks about his work, talking to musicians and musical performers and how they were impacted by COVID, and some of their feelings around funding streams, particularly for musicians and musical performers. So that's a good, oh great, that's in the chat now. So that's a good accompanying piece to check out as well. And then since 2016, we have asked this question to artists of, do you find grant funding for artists in the greater Pittsburgh region to be fair and equitable? What you're looking at in this chart is what happens when we pull out the people who say they are unsure. There are a good number of people who say that they are unsure because they either have never applied for funding or they don't know about it, or it's not something that they have an opinion about. But this chart represents folks who do have an opinion, one way or the other. And so we see for the first time that when you look at all artists, we had more people say yes, they do find funding equitable than said no. That's the first time that's happened. That is not true though when you filter the data for BIPOC artists. So over time, we've had more folks say yes, fewer folks say no, but it hasn't crossed over like it has for the average of all artists. And then when you filter specifically to Black artists, you do see, more than 2/3 of Black artists who do feel that they have an opinion, still saying no, they do not feel that funding is equitable in our region. And then, oh, sorry, go ahead, Natalie, I saw you on mute.
Oh, I just wanted to say, I got a note in the chat that some people may be driving and aren't able to read the quote. So I just wanted to read that out loud real quick.
You beat me to it, go for it.
Okay. So this artist says, I don't find the allocation of funding equitable at all. Opportunities for exposure have extended to BIPOC and LGBTQIA folks, but without commensurate pay.
Thank you very much. Okay, so that's the end of the artist discussion. Because of time, I will move us here forward in a few minutes, but are there any sort of lingering questions with the artist section that I can address quickly? Yes. Okay. So Daniel Schaefer asked, is there more focus on the not sure? Yes. So you'll see that entire chart of who said not sure. And I also was thinking about this today, and I was thinking like, well, also, I think it's difficult to judge those things on a binary. It's really helpful, I think, to have the data over time that exists in that binary of yes or no. But I was thinking to myself, if asked that question, I would still say no. But if I was asked about certain aspects of funding, I might have different opinions. You know what I mean? So like I acknowledge the limitations of that question. Yes, but yes, Daniel, there is going to be more emphasis and more discussion of that in the technical report. So thank you for asking. Great. Okay, awesome. Okay, we're going to launch into organization data. So similar to artists, we looked at COVID-19 impact primarily in financial measures, though in some other measures too. We looked at a whole bunch of different ways in which an organization might be impacted by COVID. And I will say the ones that we have, we'll talk about that were most clear, we could talk about today. And I think that there are probably plenty of other ones that just didn't show up in our data as well. So when we looked at organizations that were reporting deficits, I saw Daniel Fauner is here, so I'm going to shout him out and say thank you. Daniel helped me look at some population deficit levels for organizations, all arts and culture organizations in Allegheny County, because in the data, and this is in the report, I just present it with caution. In 2018, only about 18% of our organizations said that they had ended their most recent fiscal year in a deficit. This year, that was 37%. I think that increase is a little inflated if you just look at those two numbers together. But what I do feel really confident about, and I do want to share with you, because we saw it consistently across all levels of impact, is that for any financial impact of COVID-19 appears to be impacting small to medium organizations and performing arts organizations most acutely, or most commonly, I should say. So here you see, 37% of the respondents said, and this was after we deduped the data to make sure there weren't multiple responses from the same organization, but about 37% of the organizations ended their most recent fiscal year in a deficit, and that was higher specifically for small to medium and performing arts organizations. And then a big part of the reason that this may be is because folks are still not seeing their audiences, by and large, return to the same level of attendance that they had pre-pandemic. So almost half of our respondents said they didn't expect their organization to return to full attendance until sometime in 2023 or later than 2023. So I think that has a lot to do with some of that lingering financial impact. And then in addition, we did ask everyone to report their revenue composition pre-pandemic and revenue composition as of now, so this as of June. And I want to note that this is comparing the same sample. So this is, we asked folks to report their organization's revenue composition pre and now. And so this is the same group of people. There's no kind of weird apples to oranges comparison happening there. And you see this sort of slight preference towards earned income pre-pandemic, and then this slightly greater reliance on contributed income as of June of this year. What's not in these charts, it is in the report, is that when you look at performing arts organizations specifically, on average, pre-pandemic, they were earning about 47% of their revenue from earned sources, and that earned proportion is down to, on average, 34%. So a pretty big jump downwards. Oh, that's a great question, Stephanie. I don't know. I mean, anecdotally, I've seen it a lot because I've been looking at 990s a lot recently. And anecdotally, I would say that's true. Aaron, I don't know that I have enough data on hand to say whether that's like true at a population level across the board. Performing arts attendance were down and visual orgs were up.
Can you read the questions? I'm sorry.
No, you're absolutely fine.
Thank you.
No, that's my bad. I appreciate that. So Stephanie said, I'm wondering how many orgs operating budgets shrank overall. And the answer is I don't have the data on that, but I'd be curious about that too. Aaron says, I presume the performing arts were down on attendance and visual arts orgs were up. I don't have enough data on that. And there are a few other comments as well. As I switch the slide, Allison, do you mind reading those two extra comments from Stephanie and Aaron?
Absolutely. So Stephanie said that might account for this percentage change.
Yeah.
And then Aaron says MOA said they were up higher than before COVID.
I mean, yes, some organizations also did say, even in the survey, that they had higher attendance now than they did before COVID. That is something that is happening at some organizations. Not the majority, not even close, but it is happening in some. Okay. So through our work with organization working groups and other places where we have touch points with organizations, we heard a lot about, you know, difficulty staffing positions or concerns about sort of the impact of the Great Resignation, as it's been called, on the arts. So we did ask folks in the organization survey to report, you know, when you're considering job and career options, how important to you are each of the following. And what we found is that in terms of how people rated these regarding importance, personal interest and passion for the work that you do ended up on top. What's really important to me is that we don't take this to mean that wages and benefits don't matter to people. I think we know that they do, but in addition, when you see a weighted score of 4 or above, that means that answer was weighted at an average of important. So very important was 5, important was 4. So you see everything except for benefits on this chart is weighted at an average of important. And I think what's super important to take away is when you look at our respondents with disabilities and our BIPOC respondents, flexibility in work setting or hours was were rated by both groups with higher importance. And I think just in general, when we're thinking about recruiting and retaining folks with that lens of DEAI, having this data and understanding that is important and is potentially helpful in making sure that we're providing work environments that are welcoming to folks from these groups. I see some chats. Allison, would you mind reading those chats to me, please?
Yep. So Molly says most theater companies are reporting between 25 to 40% decreases in audience size.
I have heard that, and yeah, I've heard that as well. Anecdotally, and there's a lot of national work on this. There are several national studies that have documented this same thing in performing arts. It was just important to me too that we looked at it locally, just to show that was true, that national data, that national trend was true here in Pittsburgh as well.
And then Katie says it's similar for orchestras regionally and nationally.
Yep.
And Sarah says this is consistent with national data from the Audience Outlook Monitor. Anecdotal data from Boston is that museum attendance is up and performing arts attendance is down across the board. And she recently relocated to Pittsburgh from Boston and work with arts orgs in Boston.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, thank you all for sharing those. So again, sort of to the issue of the Great Resignation as it pertains to the arts, we did ask, how likely are you to remain working in the arts for the next 2 years? You see on the screen that almost 90% of folks said very likely or somewhat likely. I do want to be clear. I think that there is some bias in who is responding to these surveys and how they might respond to this question. So if you think about who is likely to fill out a 30-some question survey about their sector, people who are feeling really disengaged with their sector or disillusioned probably aren't as likely to fill that out. And so I definitely want to say, I think there is bias in this data, but I still wanted to present it because it was an important part of our research questions. Okay, DEAI needs and trends. I'm checking my time already. Okay, so across the board, equity and inclusion, when we ask a open-ended question in the organization and the artist survey about issues that folks feel need to be addressed, not just at their organization, but by the sector as a whole to ensure a healthy future. And then similar to how we looked at the COVID impact stories for artists, we then go and code those responses by themes. And so for the past 3 surveys, equity and inclusion in one form or another has been the most commonly raised issue. Sometimes that is, specific to systemic racism. Sometimes it's brought up in the context of, intersectional issues across various groups. But as a whole, that is the most often named issue in our community. And then when you look at the top 5 challenges and barriers specifically for organizations, the top rated one this year was increasing equity, diversity, inclusion within board, staff, and audiences. I want to note the majority of the organizations represented in these responses are predominantly white organizations. When you filter down to BIPOC-led and serving organizations, this is not their top challenge. But I know, Natalie, also you noticed that this is the same, that some issue of equity and diversity is also the top challenge identified for artists as well. That's correct, right?
Yes, yeah, for ensuring a healthy community in the Pittsburgh area, equity inclusion was rated as the top issue by artists.
Yeah, so for organizations and for artists, and then this is the top challenge for specifically predominantly white organizations. And so this year we decided to add a question about policies or activities related to DEAI work that have been adopted by organizations to date. And so these are the answers in order of commonality, of how common they were. Flexible work environments, which I imagine for many organizations were enacted at some point in COVID, were the top. And then DEAI statements were the second highest. I'm just going to pause and kind of let you take in that chart as well. But I'm curious, if you have, thoughts about what you think next time around will be a category where we see more, more organizations reporting it. I'd be curious to see what you think. And a note, these do not represent effectiveness. They just represent occurrence and adoption, but wanted to present it regardless. And we also have a section of findings around funding. So I mentioned before that the top 5 barriers and challenges for BIPOC organizations were not the same as they were for predominantly white organizations. And that, in fact, is that BIPOC organizations, whether they're led or serving, and those are sort of self-defined by the respondents, weighted contributed income as their top challenge or barrier, followed by other measures of income as well, or I should say revenue. And then for the first time, we did ask organization respondents to report their feelings about fairness in funding. We haven't done that before. We've only asked artists before. So this one does actually include the unsure answers. So as you can see, a pretty large portion of folks are unsure, which makes sense because if you don't work in development, you might not have an opinion. But one second. Slightly more people said no than yes of those who do have an opinion. And what was interesting to me is when we looked at differences across demographics, the difference much more correlated to the type of organization that you worked for compared to personal demographics. So if you looked at differences by respondent race, there weren't huge differences, but if you looked at the types of organizations that someone worked for, by respondents from BIPOC-led organizations and LGBTQ+-led organizations were much more likely to say no, they did not feel that funding was fair and equitable. Oh, there's some great stuff in the chat. I'm going to move forward and look at that. So I'm going to take a second and just look at these. Katie says, just what I was going to say, Morgan, it'd be interesting next time to follow up on these items to measure what has actually happened in these areas. Other assessment of DEAI outcomes. I agree. That was definitely like a weakness in that question, as I wanted to spend more time thinking about, how to measure effectiveness. And I'm still thinking about that. And it's kind of an area of future interest in research for me as well. And then Rayvon says, is there additional information on where the earned income sales came from for the artists in the report? Yes. So one of the questions asks what your sources of income are, and then another question asks what proportion of your income do you earn from your artistic endeavors. Those are not in the report that you received, but they will be in the technical report. And by the way, if there is anything that is not in this report that's coming out on Monday, that's published on Monday, if you're curious about it, in the meantime, between now and me publishing that technical report, if you want that data, just reach out to me. None of it is behind lock and key. It's all anonymized, so it's safe to share. And so if you have questions about those things, please feel free to reach out and I can answer them if I have the data to answer them. So yeah, any other questions? I'm gonna stop sharing. I wanna see your faces.
And just for sake of time, everyone, this is Allison. There's about 10 minutes left. So I encourage use of chat and asking Morgan and Natalie for any questions in particular. And there's one in the chat right here, Morgan.
Yeah, so Josie asked, can you speak to how you define BIPOC-led or BIPOC serving? Okay, so there's a question in the organization survey that says, and I might get the exact wording wrong, but it says, is your organization's leadership or mission representative of any specific group? And so those were self-defined by the people. And so there's a little bit more about this in the report, but about a third of our organizations said yes, and then they specified the group. So in terms of the BIPOC-led or serving organizations, if that answer was yes, specifically Black or African-American or African diaspora, which were the most common ones, we had another one say Hispanic. That was how we bucketed those groups. It's a little imperfect, as is pretty much any definition of those types of organizations, but that's how we did it. And then similar with LGBTQ+, if that is what was named in that box, that's how they got grouped into that type of organization. Awesome, okay. Okay, hold on one second. Molly asks, do we have data on where to whom actual foundation and grant funding dollars went? Especially, we don't in this survey. That is, okay, sorry, I didn't finish reading the question. I let my brain get ahead of me. So let me reread that again. Do we have data on where to whom actual foundation and grant funding dollars went, especially BIPOC artists / orgs versus white-led orgs? Interested in the difference in perception of funding and how it correlates to the dollars given. Very fair question. So what I will tell you is this, in 2018, this is before I was with the organization, but the Arts Council published a report called Racial Equity and Arts Funding in Greater Pittsburgh. So you can check out how that broke out in 2018. That is definitely on our radar as something that we would like to follow up with, but I don't have that data from 2022 as of now. Yeah, me too. Stay tuned, is all I have to say.
And Morgan, I just want to see, did you see Rayvon's? I was wondering if there's information on, okay, you saw that. Okay, we already got that. Great.
I have Stephanie, did you ask personal demographic data about cultural workers? Yes. If so, could you better filter to see how many BIPOC or LGBTQ+ workers are executive level or leaders? I can. I didn't. Because of, I'm just thinking about how I know the employment levels were spread out. I don't know if the samples of each and the subsamples of each are going to be large enough to do an analysis that I feel like is accurate at the population level, but I'm certainly willing to look at it. Does that answer your question, Stephanie? I just don't think we have enough data to do that analysis. Yeah, because I just think the samples will be too small to be able to make really accurate analyses.
There was a second question, like a follow-up from Rayvon. I don't know if I
oh no,
I missed don't miss that. Yeah,
that's my bad.
Yeah, it says, I was wondering if there was information on difference between online versus gallery versus other channels, since that has been a big trend.
Rayvon, that's a great question. And the answer is that is not something that we asked about. I've seen other data on that, and I'm trying to remember where, but I haven't seen anything on it for Pittsburgh in particular. If anybody else has seen that data, please feel free to put it in the chat. Oh, great. Okay, Daniel has some data from PACE, seeing that there was a report from PACE that came out last year, or 2020, that spoke broadly. Sorry, the chat is moving. One moment. That spoke broadly at giving levels per org, leadership by race/ethnicity. However, it didn't specify on BIPOC artists or arts organizations. Yeah, and Mitch is kind of letting the cat out of the bag on the racial equity thing. But again, TBD. Okay, any other questions? Yes, so Katie says, I think the Bayer Center's nonprofit salary report may also have some of that information. Not sure how comprehensive, but worth a look. We do have a report from 2019 that says a little bit of that. I'm not sure how much, I'd have to look back. I don't remember how much it covers race, ethnicity for people at different employment levels. Okay. Any other questions?
We have about 4 more minutes. So if anyone has any questions, go for it. I can read that for you, Morgan.
Oh yes, please, thank you.
Okay, Sarah says, I'm curious about the grouping of DEAI together. Would you consider a specific focus on accessibility in a next survey? Lots of moving factors in that arena, especially in the last 2 years.
Yes.
And Katie just said, me neither. Gender has been a big focus of theirs recently, both with regards to compensation and leadership.
I'm imagining that, Katie, you're saying that in reference to the Bayer Center. Is my guess. Okay, cool. Okay, regarding DEAI, we had that question in there because of how we use that acronym. We did pick up, and this is in the report, we did pick up greater mentions of accessibility as a priority for organizations than we had in previous years. So I agree. I think that that is an increasing area of focus. And I am always open to feedback on how to make this survey better and more representative of our needs next time we run it. So absolutely, I would definitely consider sort of breaking those particular pieces out. Yeah, no, I agree.
Stephanie says, shared definitions of these words are needed for sure. DEAI.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. I mean, even across various organizations, I know we use different acronyms, slightly different definitions and whatnot. So I agree. Well, okay.
Yay, getting lots of
in the chat. Yeah. Appreciate that. Wonderful. Well, please do feel free to email me. Should you have any other questions. I'm going to be honest with you regarding some of the questions about the technical report. It's just taking me a long time to get that out because I'm making sure that it does have that analysis across different groups. So I apologize. Oh, Bob, can the complete report be found on your website? It will be live on the website on Monday. It will be live on the website on Monday. And then the technical report, it will come out. It's going to take me several more weeks to get it there. So again, please, in the meantime, if you're curious about something, email me. I can get it to you as long as I have it. Wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us on a Friday. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you all for your questions. And yes, let's stay in touch.
Thank you all so much. We will have a recording of this, and there will be a post survey emailed to you as well. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out. Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you all. And big thanks to our ASL interpreter. We appreciate you.
Thanks.